My name is Edgar Mannheimer, and this is Kalam, a podcast about the Middle East.
And people have been so generous with us in terms of their time, their resources, whether it's the Sápmi people in northern Sweden, I should say Sápmi, or the indigenous tribe in Borneo in Malaysia. I filmed those two stories 2 weeks apart, and they're halfway across the world, living in entirely different environments, but they have identical struggles, and they have very similar mentalities in many ways.
The voice you just heard belongs to Salem Barahmeh, the founder of Uncivilized Media, a media channel that tells stories about people and places that are underrepresented, silenced, or erased. Very similar to what we're trying to do at Kalam Podcast. I first met Salem on a cold, rainy day in Stockholm several years ago. At the time, he was working with PIPD, the Palestinian Institute for Public Diplomacy. He was traveling the Western world trying to lobby for the Palestinian cause with politicians, diplomats, and grassroots organizers. Since then, Salem has pivoted into storytelling and political education, catering largely to the masses on social media. He and Uncivilized Media produce documentaries, explainers, and other kind of videos about politics from what we used to call the Third World. And he's been very successful. We'll be getting back to Barahmeh and his storytelling that connects stories of struggle from northern Sweden to Palestine to Taiwan. But first, a reminder. Kalam Podcast is made possible through listeners just like you. If you enjoy listening to Kalam Podcast, please subscribe to the show in whatever podcast application you're listening to right now. And please give us a rating. It helps other people find out about us. And if you'd like to support the show with a small donation, consider signing up to Kalam Podcast on Patreon for just $3 a month. In addition to supporting the show, you'll gain access to lots of great bonus content. We have Kalam Shorts, for example, which is our own explainers about concepts and terms that are important to our discussion on the podcast. We also have Munadama, where the creators of Kalam Podcast sit down for a kind of loose and chill discussion about the work. For that and much more, go to patreon.com and search Kalam Podcast, or go straight to patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. That's patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. Now, on to the show.
Why is it important for you and the Sápmi people to show that you exist?
This is from an episode of Uncivilized Media where Salem Barahmeh, today's guest on Kalam Podcast, goes to the northernmost regions of Sweden to visit the indigenous Sápmi people, who my own country has committed a cultural genocide against. What is brilliant about the work done by Salem and Uncivilized Media is that he connects the dots between Sápmi people living in the snow-white north of Scandinavia with the struggles of Palestinians, or the Vietnamese, or the Algerians. Uncivilized is a good name. It's how most recently Western, but really throughout history, all imperial powers have referred to, in inverted commas, the other. It is, like many other derogatory terms, something which can be reclaimed, much like Jay Electronica does in this verse on his song, The Pledge.
Voodoo man, tap dancing in the French Quarter, walking on water with a scroll in my hand. The blueprints for a dish-shaped light vessel that was chiseled out of metal off the coast of Japan. Fastened on the top of a mountain out into postland, saw a shiny object floating out of the ocean. I'm sort of like a postman. You can get the message if you want to understand from the raps
On
and the
November
man.
7th, saw this disc-shaped object floating above the sea concourse of
Voodoo
United
man,
Airlines.
civilized and savage,
Very
criticized the
low in
parish,
the
spreading
sky.
false
There was still
doctrine, terrorizing
daylight, very
cleric, carrying on nonsense, specialized lies to
look
paralyze
like
the
an airplane, a
conscience. Voodoo
helicopter, or
man,
anything else.
chit-chatter, abracadabra, spitting out matter while I'm shitting out data. Chew 'em up, shitting out rappers, sipping Pellegrino while I'm giving out matches. Set yourself on fire, let the wisdom of Elijah purify you. Take a nigga higher, sold your soul to the highest. By you now you're on the wire. You're talking about 2-foot tires, saying you sell crack, clapping at cats with Max, but you a liar. Pants on fire, same old rugged cross, different crucified Messiah.
Civilize the savage, criticize the parish for spreading false doctrine, terrorize the cleric for carrying on nonsense, specialized lies to paralyze the conscience. What a scathing indictment of Western colonialism wrapped up in missionary work. A fantastic verse, if you ask me. One of my favorite songs ever. Anyway, this isn't an episode of Spotify Dissect. This is Kalam Podcast. And now, without further ado, here's Salem Barahmeh. Salem Barahmeh is the founder of Uncivilized Media, a media channel that tells stories about people and places that are unrepresented, silenced, or erased. Salem, thank you so much for speaking with us today on Kalam Podcast.
Thank you, man. It's great to be with you and great to see you again.
Great to see you again. We met actually a few years ago, and at the time you were doing strictly Palestine advocacy for PIPD. And since you've kind of transitioned a little bit, you're doing slightly different things. So can you tell us, like, what are you doing right now? What is Uncivilized Media, and how is that transition?
Yeah, man. So Uncivilized is a bit over a year and a half now. And I left PIPD, the organization I founded and kind of led for 5 years from Palestine. The idea with Uncivilized came actually from a trip to South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So I took my camera with me, and the idea was we were going to go learn from the South African experience and the fight against apartheid and settler colonialism there. And so I wanted to kind of also document it. And I stayed a bit after, and I spent some time with the MK, which is the armed wing of the ANC. And over a week, we went into their communities. We talked to different people, whether activists, academics. And it was a very eye-opening experience. I think both the combination of learning from the ANC, spending time with those folks, it really gave me a political framework in which I saw truly how the playbook of colonialism and many systems of domination were very similar. A lot of what was happening or happened in South Africa was copy and pasted into the Palestinian context by Israel and their settler colony. And so the other thing I learned is also the resistance to these systems of domination also had a similar playbook. And there was a lot to learn, not only from the South African experience, but from the Vietnamese experience, from the Algerian experience, from the African-American experience in the US. So when I transitioned, I moved away from saying, look, I do want to focus on Palestine, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of value in connecting these different struggles around the world and try to do it through stories and narratives that haven't been introduced to kind of the mainstream on social media, and to tell it in really compelling ways that essentially, provide people with value and education and information. So that was the move from PIPD and Uncivilized is the recognition and really truly understanding that we're not free till we're all free. And that really landed in South Africa. And so moved more so from more traditional advocacy, which was as when we met lobbying members of parliament across Europe and also members of Congress in the US and think tanks in the media, etc. And moving to this idea that we cannot continue trying to nudge people who, because of very specific contexts and structures, might be very hard to move on Palestine. Yeah. But more so, it's about building our own table and centering us and our stories. And I think that will attract people in its own way. And I think that was the heart of it. I really wanted to tell stories, and I wanted to do it without catering to the West. Yeah, yeah. And that's essentially why I decided to leave PIPD and start Uncivilized and work on Uncivilized. But PIPD is still doing amazing work, and it's led by my co-director Inas, my partner in crime, and the political work around advocacy is still very important, right? Yeah. It's just it's I think I did it, and I wanted to also explore other things, including filmmaking and storytelling. I think those are things I've always been interested in, and Uncivilized also allows me to do that. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Shout out to PIPD. That's the Public Institute for
The Palestinian Institute for Public Diplomacy.
Nice, yeah.
And
It's always been a long name. We inherited that name, but yeah, it's doing good stuff. It's doing good stuff.
For sure. Shout out to Inas. We actually had Inas on the podcast when I was in Ramallah earlier this summer.
Amazing,
and that's
amazing.
like videos that are yet to be released.
All right, shout out Inas. Let's go
for sure. But so yeah, I guess you went from like lobbying politicians in the West, basically where your audience was that politician. You would sit like in a closed meeting room, and it's that now you're like, I guess it's a different strategy of like it's more of a people power thing, trying to your audience is now, you know, the tens of thousands of followers you have, probably hundreds of thousands across different channels. And I guess you've kind of found your voice in that. But tell me about the process of like finding that sweet spot, because Palestine isn't necessarily a popular subject. I mean, it's and as well like anti-Western politics, not anti-Western, but like, you know, revolutionary politics around the world. It's hard to find that voice where people can connect to it, even if they're not necessarily Vietnamese or not necessarily from an oppressed group, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Look, the theory of change with PIPD was how do you find pressure points within a specific country or society to nudge change towards Palestine? That included politicians, but it also included more grassroots activism. So the idea was to engage with both. I think while I was there, and also during that time I was an activist in Palestine, trying to build with other really amazing people this movement to challenge the stagnation within our representative system internally, like the PLO, etc. And one of the things that I found missing in both contexts was this idea of political education within the grassroots, within the movement abroad, and even within the political education of Palestinians in Palestine. And with Uncivilized, I think the core of what we're doing is political education, right? And it took a while to figure out our voice, our tone, the subjects we wanted to cover. And a lot of it is an iterative process. It's about experimentation and seeing kind of where you feel comfortable. And so we started out doing all kinds of different stories, but we still had a guiding principle, which is, look, there's dominant hegemonic narratives in the world, and they lend and facilitate the oppression that we've experienced and a lot of us have experienced. How do we challenge these narratives without catering too much to them, but centering us? You know, this goes back to this idea, which I really believe in, is we center our stories and people will come. You know, I don't have to package it or sell it to someone. You know, I just will do my best to tell the best story I can and center the story itself. So that was a really important insight, right? And it was something that kind of was our North Star from the beginning.
Right.
The style, the editing, the storytelling approach, I think evolved with time.
Yeah.
But one thing that I think really was personal for me, and then is now being reflected on the videos and the stories and the content we make, is after October 7th, there were moments where I was feeling a lot of rage, and there was moments of feeling a lot of frustration. And I could sense, because we were watching a genocide unfold live before our eyes, I also felt a deep sense of, there was a plummeting in morale. You know, everybody was devastated, right? And for me, one way I would find a bit of, I don't want to say hope, but a bit of clarity, something to hold on to, was to go back in history. Because in many ways, what's happening in Palestine is unique, but it's also not exceptional to history. Many different people, many different struggles have encountered many forms of what we are encountering now. And so being able to look at these things and contextualize them within the broad brushstrokes of history, I was able to find a sense of clarity in moving forward. And that's when I said, okay, we're doing videos about Palestine, but they're also connected to Algeria.
Over 5 million Algerians were killed by French colonialism. This is what the Algerian struggle for liberation can teach us about Palestine, and how colonial violence is used to overwhelm, deter, and completely paralyze demands for freedom.
Algiers, a busy piece of metropolitan
Which is a struggle that lasted 132 years. We're still in like we're still in the seventh decade of our struggle. You know, we're talking about a 132-year struggle. You know, where French colonialism killed 5 million Algerians. Yeah. The struggle against colonialism in South Africa took over 300 years. The struggle in Vietnam is also centuries long. These things are not measured by months or years, they're measured by decades. And I think that was important for me to remember. But then it was also important to put out there. And also looking at different elements of the struggles, whether it's armed resistance, whether it's international solidarity, whether it's the being able to rely on your neighbors for alliances that help you push your struggle forward. There are different elements of each struggle that Palestine has or doesn't have that could teach us a lot about where things are going. Also, being able to understand that Zionism right now is in a stage of decomposition as an ideology. Also, this idea of guerrilla warfare versus urban warfare versus the tactics that we're seeing unfold in Gaza. So that for me gave me something to hold on to. And I wanted to share with people because I felt the morale and I felt the despair and I felt the disappointment and anger and rage, which are all very valid emotions. But they cannot cloud you completely because we're still engaged in a political struggle. And that's kind of where a lot of the stories came from, because I needed them for myself to make me feel better. So that's when we did a story on Algeria, we did a story on Vietnam and Hamas and the similarity in tactics.
Hamas is more the Viet Cong than ISIS. What if I told you this statement can explain why Israel reluctantly accepted a temporary ceasefire, and that the history of colonialism in Vietnam and the American defeat by the Viet Cong can explain what's happening in Palestine and shed light on Hamas's strategy?
We did one about the Jewish resistance to the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the single largest revolt by Jews against the Germans during World War II. Despite the tragic fate, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising fundamentally changed history for reasons you wouldn't expect. But what can it teach us about the human spirit of resistance, and how can it shed light on what's happening in Palestine right now?
What was it like?
And a bunch more, and that's essentially kind of the foundation. And we do these explainers, or we do longer form documentaries that are more travel based. So I spent 4 or 5 months in Southeast Asia. I went to Malaysia, did something around climate change and the indigenous people there and fighting deforestation of the oldest forest. Taiwan, to talk about what happens if China invades. Thailand, we went and interviewed one of the men who was taken prisoner by Hamas, and then we interviewed the negotiator that got him out, who went to Iran.
ก็ถูกตบตี3 วันแรกครับ
This is probably Manny.
มานี่มือต้องเขาบอกเขามาเนี่ย
I think he doesn't want to come. Did Manny change after he was taken prisoner?
แตกต่างครับเพราะว่าเมื่อก่อนนี้ไม่เคยใจร้อนนะจะปกติไม่
So
ไม่ค่อยพูด
many different stories that connect, a lot of these anti-hegemonic narratives that are important to establish and promote.
I think it's rare, to see a media that is like kind of devoid of ideology. I mean, to do like a show that compares guerrilla tactics between Hamas and Vietnam, and then to do something about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and then to do something about Taiwan. I mean, like you could see I could see Uncivilized being like simply only, very leftist Marxist struggles, but then you have like Taiwan in the mix, which is like very much not that, you know what I mean? Was that a discussion that you had at one point? Like, we don't want to like be associated with a specific political ideology?
Well, I think everything is political and can be framed as ideological to an extent. At the end of the day, I'm Palestinian, and at the end of the day, I do have core beliefs, and they're reflected in the work. This idea of objectivity in journalism is bullshit. I don't buy into it.
Yeah, of course, I agree with that.
Right, and so whether you work for a wire or whatever, the way you frame a story, the headline, which quote goes where, who do you quote, all has political impact and is influenced by the person's politics who's working on it.
Exactly,
or the institution.
But you could strive towards objectivity, which is, I think, something that you do. But at the end of the day, like, you're not. I mean, no one is.
Exactly. And for us, like the principles that, I'm not a journalist. I never claimed to be a journalist. I'm also not an activist. I tell stories, and whatever you want to call that. I think it's within the I think the age we're in, and within the social media and this idea of content creation, I think we're kind of charting our own way. Not uncivilized. There's many of us who are doing it. It's not just me or Tala, who I work with, but there are others, and I think it's its own unique thing, which is interesting. Now, we employ the ethics of journalism, which is the fact checking, the sources, all of that, right? These stories, especially the explainers, any stories, but especially the explainers, because they interweave a lot of things, follow a very methodological approach to research and etc. So that's important to us. One thing that has allowed me to kind of really tell these stories in a way that doesn't seem biased to a very specific ideology is I really go in there with an open mind. I do not, and few people have said this about our work, is they don't feel like we've come to a place with a foregone conclusion that we're coming to confirm, with our reporting or our storytelling. Actually, really curious to see where the story leads us. And it was the case, for example, in Thailand. When we went to meet the negotiator, I had no idea he was going to say what he was going to say, and we left a lot of that stuff in. Similar with the prisoner. Yeah. He criticized Hamas. He talked about Hamas beating him. We left that in there. That's where the story took us.
It's commendable of you.
Yeah, and that's also part of it. Look, and I went to Taiwan with the curiosity that if the US loses in South Asia or Southeast Asia, East Asia, they're going to be fundamentally, their hegemony, their power in the world is going to be fundamentally challenged and diminished, because basically they're losing in Europe through Ukraine. Strategically, they're losing in the Middle East because Israel has just gone off the rails to a point of no return. And so the last big place where the US is investing a lot of resources and power is East Asia. If they lose there, that's the end of essentially a unipolar world with America being the dominant superpower. So I was like, all right, let me go check this out. Let's see what's happening in Taiwan. So I went to Taiwan and started doing our research and talking to people before we started filming. And it was a very fascinating story because actually a lot of the Taiwanese are not pro-American. It blew my mind. They're refusing to speak English as a second language, right? And I thought, because it's been under US influence basically for over 60, 70 years, that it would be. No, they're refusing to. They say, if we want to speak a second language, we want to speak Japanese. Okay. They're like, we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine. Yeah. In terms of what it's like to be an American ally, and it doesn't look good. We don't think these guys are going to come save us. And they're like, we're on our own, and if China comes and invades, we're going to engage in guerrilla warfare. So this episode is not out yet, but I went to train with them. No way. So I went to train with them, but again, we're not adopting the Taiwanese narrative either. Because China has its own narrative. China says, look, this has always been part of China, and this was colonially carved up. And essentially after the Chinese Civil War, the losing party went to Taiwan and solidified that colonial division. Yeah, which is also a very interesting narrative. And so we don't choose either narrative. We just show you what it is for what it is within the context of geopolitics. Yeah. So it's a really amazing episode to film. It's coming at some point. But yeah, to go back to your question, we do have our political foundation, but we don't conform to any box. I hate categories, and I don't. That's why we're doing a bunch of things. Like the last video we made, which we released yesterday, was about why watermelon is a symbol of freedom for within the Black liberation struggle. Thank you. And before that was why Kamala Harris is a psyop, basically. It's whatever we're interested in, and we feel like it's relevant, we tell the story. Yeah.
I think that's really refreshing to hear. I think that we're trying to do similar things on Kalam podcast, and I myself, I've always been a journalist, and I mean I still am, also like now a storyteller, but like but I'm not an activist, right? But I think sometimes when you do things that are connected with Palestine, you kind of like find yourself in that category, or people kind of like assume that you are. And I've always lived in like the blurred lines, and that's what I find most interesting, like in the gray zone, like where things are not really clear, because usually things aren't, but obviously in a moment like this, it's not surprising. It's expected that people kind of fall back into their like positions. But how have you guys experienced that? Do you receive a lot of criticism from like the pro-Palestinian movement that you're like not doing enough like for Palestine or whatever?
No, not at all. I think people really appreciate the content we do because it's in its own way unique. And again, I've been an activist for Palestine most of my all of my adult life. So I'm very familiar with that terrain. I'm very familiar with the movement, whether in a personal capacity, whether through my work with PIPD. No, I think people respect and see us for what we are. I mean, there's no claim that our stories are going to liberate Palestine by any means, but I think people see us as a place to come learn and watch cool videos. And that's what we are. And we never promote or advertise that we're more than that, right? Yeah. And so at the end of the day, like we've got really criticized for one video since we've started.
Okay.
More than anything. And it was a video about Iran. So the video basically, the first time Iran responded directly to Israel was a few months ago, right? They fired rockets in retaliation to the bombing of their embassy/consulate in Syria. And it was a new thing. And so what I found interesting is that there's a lot of misunderstanding of the geopolitical strategy of Iran and the Iranian regime, and how they maneuver in this world, and how they've been able to survive since the 79 revolution. And so I wanted to explain the strategy, the geopolitical strategy, with no value judgment on whether the strategy is good or bad, and no value judgment whether the regime is good or bad. I'm just taking the behavior and putting it within a context and a theory of change. And it was based basically on Khomeini's inspiration for strategic thinking, which is one, mountain climbing, two, this ancient Iranian dance, and those things have entered his strategic conceptual framework. He uses them a lot in his speeches.
Yeah.
So it was the analysis that I was hoping to provide, and this stuff is covered in think tanks, right? It's not where people who are on social media are not often going to think tanks or reading foreign policy or foreign affairs.
Yeah.
Right? So I basically take a lot of that research and condense it into a video. Yeah. And within the context of like policy makers, etc., this type of conversation is very usual, right?
Yeah.
Because people think about the strategic thinking of a country.
Yeah. Without taking sides necessarily.
Without taking sides. And because Iran was playing a bigger role in what's happening in Palestine at the moment. And obviously it's played a huge role in the Middle East for the last 2 decades. So I released the video, and there was a lot of positive reviews of the video. But the right-wing Iranian diaspora...
They're very intense.
They're very intense, especially in the US.
In Tehran,
yeah, they saw that for some reason as a way of glorifying the regime.
Yeah.
Right? And so there was a lot of attacks on the video from them. But a lot of Iranians from Iran and everybody else basically was incredibly supportive of the video. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting to see that dynamic. And I don't claim to be an expert in Iranian politics and social dynamics, right?
Yeah.
I think the level of mobilization, and in terms of numbers, it wasn't massive, but they were very loud.
Yeah.
And they tend to be these people also tend to be very Zionist,
Yeah.
Islamophobic, many other things. But yes, so that's the video I think we've received the most criticism for. But in terms of
Right.
Palestine, I think people just see us for what we are, a social media channel that provides cool, entertaining, but educational videos.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. So, what are some of the like conceptual through lines that you've seen? We've spoken about the different trips that you've made, some of them at least, to Taiwan and Vietnam, and you've even been in northern Sweden, I believe, or was it Norway? Interviewing,
Sweden,
interviewing the indigenous nomadic people of Scandinavia, the Sápmi people.
Yeah.
What are some of the like the conceptual through lines, and by that I mean like the ideas that people have in common that you speak with?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm always amazed by how generous people are. So I don't want to go from the conceptual. I want to go from like the human trait. I think everywhere we've gone, we've been incredibly well received, and people have been so generous with us in terms of their time, their resources. Whether it's the Sápmi people in northern Sweden, I should say Sápmi. Or the indigenous tribe in Borneo in Malaysia. I filmed those two stories 2 weeks apart, and they're halfway across the world, living in entirely different environments, but they have identical struggles, and they have very similar mentalities in many ways. The love of community, the love of the land. It was very beautiful to experience. And neither of them spoke English, but you still are able to connect with both of them on a very human level. So that was beautiful. And it's so stunning that, to me, that in Sápmi, the fight, obviously there was a cultural genocide, and a lot of it is tied to kind of extraction, exploitation of resources from the land, whether it's the mines in the north of Sweden. But in Borneo, it's the devastation of the forest, from timber companies,
right?
And the way they're fighting them is also almost identical, right? So that was just fascinating to see. I think the other thing that really, really blew my mind, because I've experienced it over the last year. I basically spent time in Canada, the U.S., Iceland. Most of my time was also in Europe. I went to Morocco, and then I spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. The amount of people I talked to that had a grand awakening about the liberal hypocrisy of the West,
right?
And how October 7th and the genocide in Gaza, how it shattered that facade the West was promoting. There was a lot leading up to it, but I think the combination of Ukraine and then Gaza really cemented in people's mind that the system was never meant for us.
Yeah.
And the conversations have been so illuminating and fascinating. And the fact that you have people from all over the world who are thinking the same thing was mind-blowing. And it's important. I think it's an important moment in history, because this grand awakening is accompanying is a shift in the global world order. The U.S. is no longer going to be the only superpower. A lot of regional powers are on the rise, and so I think what happens in the next year or two is gonna determine the way the world looks like for maybe the next 50 to 100 years.
Yeah.
Right. So we're in a moment very similar to, from 1940 to 1950, where this world order was built in that decade, I think we're going to experience something very similar very soon. And the fact that people are awakening now is very important. So that's one of the amazing through lines that I've seen, regardless of where I've been and who I've talked to. It's very present.
Yeah. That's. I think that's a good place to wrap up. Thank you so much, Salem Barahmeh.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
Keep going and keep doing amazing work. And I look forward to seeing you again in person.
Yeah, me too. That was Salem Barahmeh, founder of Uncivilized Media and episode 22 of Kalam Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. For more information and constant updates about Kalam Podcast, follow us on Instagram at Kalam Podcast. And with that, that's all from us this week. Peace. Kalam is written and hosted by me, Edgar Mannheimer. Research and production is by Sam Karl Samre, and sound design is by Arthur Mannheimer.